Oi, oi, it's your boy, the Nico Price of sugar and spice and everything nice. Jack Slack, it's the Jack Slack podcast, and we're coming at you on Monday, the 10th of July, following UFC 290. They tried for once. Really good card, loved it. We all knew it was going to be good beforehand. It was, terrific. I did loads of stuff in the lead up to this. I did a big Pantoja study article. I did a Robbie Lawler career retrospective article. I did a boycast, and we got pretty hype for it, and then it delivered, which was a really nice surprise. Well, not even a surprise. It was really nice that it delivered. I don't know if I'm going to get it all done today. There's a couple I haven't watched yet, actually, the Tatsuro Taira fight. But we'll talk about all the really important stuff today, and then we'll talk a bit more about it on the boycast, because God knows I'm not going to be spending too much time previewing Holly Holm versus Bueno Silva and Albert Duraev co-main event. But this one was money. So your main event, Alexander Volkanovski versus Yair Rodriguez. Go and read Advanced Striking 2.0 Alexander Volkanovski. It's been open to the public for a while. And in that article, I talk about him using the step-up inside low kick and the many ways that he uses it to play footsie with longer, taller fighters. Footsie is in like the, like Street Fighter footsies. But he uses the inside low kick, the step-up inside low kick, which is a technique that, it's got a preliminary step, which in some, you can do it in the very quick, like almost step and kick at the same time, like Jalen Turner was doing against Dan Hooker. But the step is actually really useful, because if you're a very good striker, a very clever striker, like Alexander Volkanovski, your point scorer has a telegraph, but you can start building expectation with that telegraph. So what he'll do sometimes is what I call a T-step jab, which he did against Brian Ortega and almost knocked his head off, so he steps his right foot up and then he kicks with his left leg to the inside thigh. Instead of doing that, you step your right foot up as if you're going to throw the inside low kick, and you do a fencer's lunge into a jab, and you can cover a ton of distance and just smack them straight in the head. If they're checking the inside low kick, even better, because they're on one leg. They can't lean with the punch, they can't roll with it, they can't fade away from it. And we talked about how he uses it. The classical setup is the inside low kick, right overhand. You'll see a lot of guys in kickboxing and Muay Thai use the inside low kick to the right uppercut. That's a really nice one. Particularly if you go low, as if you go ankle to ankle with the guy. That's a really nice defensive technique. Someone teeing off on your guard, you go long guard, so lead hand out, other hand high on your head. You frame on them, and then you kick the inside of their ankle, basically, as they're stepping out to punch, or setting their feet to punch. You knock their stance out, and you give them the uppercut afterwards. But one of the things that he does a lot is step up inside low kick and step back into southpaw. And then guys will come in on him again, trying to punch him to get him back for the inside low kick, and he'll reach out with his hands, parry, and throw a big, what is now his lead right hook. And I did a little doodle of this in the article, which I think was from the Ortega fight, or maybe the second Holloway fight. No, I think it was the Ortega fight I took it from. But he does it in a few of his fights. I've just never seen it work quite as well as in this one, because he set up the inside low. Well, he used the inside low kick to score some points every time Yair Rodriguez was throwing back off it. And eventually, he caught him a few times with it. About 3 times he chinned him really well. As Yair Rodriguez chased him back from the low kick, he hit him with the counter right hook. And the third time he stumbled him, took him to the fence, took him down, beat him up, got the TKO. But there was some really good stuff going on in this one. We were talking about, you can't low kick with a good low kicker. Yair Rodriguez's kicking technique, probably much scarier than Alexander Volkanovski's. But Alexander Volkanovski uses his kicks to accomplish things. The inside low kick he point scores with, and then he sets things up off that really nicely, or he uses it to draw people into counter right hooks from a southpaw stance. You see Israel Adesanya do the same thing with the inside low kick. He steps up into it and then steps back southpaw, and then if they don't come in on him, he throws a really hard, his left leg is now in the back, so he throws a really hard front kick or question mark kick with that. And he gave Pereira hell with that the first time that they met. Pereira was just not expecting it at all. But yes, you saw Volk landing low kicks and then trying to get out of dodge. A lot of this fight was staying too far away. You especially, 1, against kickers, and 2, when you've got a big height or reach disadvantage. All the way in, all the way out is a great rule. You want them to be having to overcommit to try and reach to you so that you can step in, and then everything, if they're running to try and get to you and then you step in on them because they think you're going to leave, they think you're going to retreat, and you step in, you've closed the distance at double speed. So that's really good for a short fighter to do that. Or you can try and crowd them, but you have to use defense and so on. He didn't really do that too much. What I really liked was the first takedown wasn't a takedown. The first takedown was a nice cut kick. Yair Rodriguez was going southpaw and throwing the left body kick and left high kick, as we expected. Those are the two things that really make him a fiend in this division. The open side double attack, because when you're southpaw versus an orthodox fighter or orthodox versus a southpaw fighter, when you're in that open stance scenario, your rear leg is going against just their rear arm. I mean, and their rear leg, or their lead leg, if they pick up the leg to do a full check. But nobody does that in MMA. Though Volkanovski did actually hit a couple of checks in this one for body kicks, which was nice. But you only have to beat that rear arm. If you try and kick someone on the lead side, they can. If it's the body kick, they'll just turn it and take it on their back. If it's a head kick, they can duck down behind the line of their shoulders. They don't even need to get their arm in the way. And you'll just skim over the top. So kicking the open side is really important, and it makes Yair Rodriguez so dangerous. So he went southpaw, he was throwing these body kicks and high kicks. Sorry, I forgot to say I've lost my voice, so that's why I sound like shit today. But Volkanovski anticipated a high kick because he'd drawn that counter a couple of times, and he threw his right kick underneath Rodriguez's high kick at his standing leg and knocked it out and got the takedown. And the cut kick is so... I think it should be more valued in MMA. And cut kick can be you kick underneath the guy's check and you catch his standing leg, or you kick underneath his kick and catch his standing leg. But in MMA, it's way more dangerous for the guy who's being cut kicked than in... the consequences of it are far more dire in MMA, because if you kick out a guy's standing leg and he falls to the mat, keeping him on the ground for 2 minutes is not that difficult. If you watch my boy Sadiq Youssef versus my other boy, Andre Fili throws some nice head kicks and body kicks in the first round, comes out for the second round, Youssef makes the read, immediately kicks the standing leg as Fili throws up a kick. Fili falls on the floor, and Sadiq Youssef, he doesn't get a lot going from top position, but he keeps him there for 2 minutes. He says, right, I'm having top time. And that's the round one, basically. Another great example of a cut kick in MMA, Fedor, once he finally had the read on Krokop and he wasn't so scared of the speed of the kicks anymore, he landed a really good cut kick and sent Krokop careening into the ropes to try and keep himself upright, because obviously Krokop was also worried about getting taken down in that fight. If you are a guy who would happily take his opponent down and you're fighting a kicker, cut kicks are the thing. Go for them all the time. Just, you have to keep your hands up because you're going to be taking a kick while on one leg. Even if you kick even if you get the timing right and you kick their standing leg as their leg comes up, Volkanovski still had to take the kick from Rodriguez on his arm. People have been knocked out by guys who are falling through the air. People have been knocked out by punches from guys who are already unconscious. So you do still have to look after yourself. So that was a really nice first takedown. If you watched his wall work, his cage work generally was excellent. Moved him immediately to the wall because we said Yair Rodriguez, even though his last 2 wins are by playing guard, the Frankie Edgar hole still exists. If you put a guy's head to the fence, doesn't matter how good he is at throwing up arm bars, you can't throw up arm bars if the guy is stacking you up. If he's too high, if your hips, when the guy is over the top of you, standing, and you have your head against the cage, the moment you open your legs to try and armbar him, your hips are going to sag and fall because of gravity. And then you can't attack the upper body anymore. And we said Frankie Edgar did an additional thing, which was to post his head on the fence, so that even if Yair did keep his hips high, he couldn't get his leg over for the armbar because there was no space between Frankie's head and the fence. So you did see Rodriguez wall walking, which was good, because the problem with people like Brian Ortega is that they won't wall walk. They'll be like, I'm a Gracie Jiu-Jitsu black belt and I'm going to play guard. And you're like, well, no, you're against the wall. Stand up, for God's sake. Or turn yourself off the wall if you're going to play guard. Like, if you're super serious about it, like Mansour Barnaoui, just turn yourself off the fence. But Volk stuck to him, wrestled him down again. It was really nice. You saw him trying to step over for the half guard and so on, which was important to try and keep Rodriguez flat. But it was a big punch in the third, really made it. But at no point in this fight did Yair Rodriguez get going. And I think that's a real testament to Volkanovski, because my preview show, which was a clip from the Boycast, which I put up on the YouTube, and in the Boycast, of course, I said that Yair Rodriguez is a really stiff challenge just because of the skills that he has. I don't think he's the best rounded fighter Volkanovski's ever fought. I don't think he's necessarily the best fighter Volkanovski's ever fought, but he has some really dangerous weapons that make him tricky, and also his physicality. He's a huge dude compared to Volkanovski in that weight class. He takes a tremendous shot. We've seen him hurt before, but this was the only time we've seen someone actually successfully follow up on it. I mean, even against Edgar, it was just like 2 rounds of being beaten violently. And then I think they stopped it between rounds, didn't they? So Volkanovski, at 34 years old, should be aging out of that division, and he just had an even better performance. I wanted to say the best performance of his career, but he just beat Max Holloway in a absolute shutout, and he also just beat Korean Zombie in a fight that made us all want Korean Zombie to just go away and never fight again. And he just had, the most competitive fight with Islam Makhachev, the champion from a weight class up. So this man is incredible. And smart, too. I mean, they read their opponent really well here. He brought all the right tools. He kept himself safe at all times. There was a couple of times he got hit. He backed Rodriguez onto the fence, and Rodriguez knew that Volkanovski was going to come in and throw, so he ducked and threw a right hand, and they both chinned each other at the same time, but Volkanovski stopped for a split second and then just completed a takedown. I don't think he's got an all-time great chin, but he's got a good enough chin that he doesn't really have to... and the wherewithal. There's chins, but there are people who take incredible shots and then just continue fighting like a zombie. It takes, they always say it's conditioning that makes you, 1, recover quicker, and 2, get your faculties back. Keep your focus after immediately after getting chinned. So great fight by Volk. Very hard to give Rodriguez much props because he didn't do anything except get beaten up. But yes, I think Max Holloway's starting to decline a bit, and Volk sort of had his number, and also he's not a knockout hitter. Korean Zombie was just a layup because Korean Zombie has been washed since. I mean, he got outstruck by Brian Ortega to the point that people thought Brian Ortega had been reborn as an elite striker, when actually then Ortega's next fight we all just went, oh no, he's still Brian Ortega. Korean Zombie's just that washed. But this is probably the most dangerous guy that Volkanovski's fought, and he made it look like a cakewalk. So what else to talk about on this card? There was an amazing co-main event, which we'll get into in a minute. I want to do Robbie Lawler first because I wrote a big piece on him this week, which you can read for free, everyone, on thefightprimer.com. I'll link it in the YouTube description, or search /Robbie Lawler or whatever on Google. It's called Robbie Lawler, Rebirth and Retirement, and it's about his sort of comeback. Robbie Lawler came into the UFC very young because he was in with Pat Miletich. And Pat Miletich was the UFC welterweight champion, the very first one, I believe. And Robbie debuted just after Pat Miletich retired, or what would be Pat Miletich's retirement. I think he sort of just drifted into retirement after losing the belt. But Robbie was always like this wild man. He'd wrestled in high school. He was working with Matt Hughes from very early on, so he's always been pretty good at getting up off the bottom. He was sort of aimless for a while. He wandered around in Elite XC, Strike Force, and so on. Strike Force, I said this last week, but I remember him being a big star in Strike Force, and I loved watching him fight. But he was 3-5 in the promotion. He wasn't a force. He was fighting up at middleweight. He went as high as 195. And then he came back down to welterweight when Strike Force got folded into the UFC. And, no one could have foreseen that he'd become not even just a great fighter, but a world champion. And defended the belt twice, or even thrice. Was it thrice? No, twice. But then he could have won it far earlier if he'd won the decision against Hendricks the first time. But yes, this was, I thought he was going to lose this one, because I thought that's just the way things go. Nico Price is pretty dangerous. Robbie Lawler has slowed way down. And even in this performance, I know people are going to be like, he turned back the clock, but he was very slow compared to what he used to be. But even then, you saw a little bit more of that scientific Robbie Lawler, the growth that he had as a striker in his post-UFC return, I suppose. He started this off with a left straight dip and then another left straight over the top. So he used, instead of a jab and dip, he used the left straight and dip because he was southpaw against an orthodox fighter to get in range to throw more punches. It was really nice. And then he caught Price ducking, so he led with a lead right hand uppercut to lift Price up, grabbed the head and hammered him with some punches from the collar tie, and Price went down, and Robbie Lawler looked really surprised and very classy, didn't hit him again. One of the things that everyone will always praise about Robbie Lawler, spare the Matt Lindland knockout, which was a bit weird, and the Trig one, which he was a bit pissy about because Trig was obviously Matt Hughes' great enemy. He was always very classy. Like whether he won or lost, he was coming over to shake your hand, and then he'd deal with whatever was going on with him. The Evan Tanner one's fantastic. That was his. He lost by submission to Evan Tanner. That was his last UFC fight, the first time round, and he loses by triangle. And he's on top of Evan Tanner, and he gives him a hand up, gives him a hug, says, well done, and then he walks away and goes, fuck, really loud. But, he dealt with congratulating the victorious man before he dealt with his own commiserating and being angry at himself. And he was always sort of that dude, like against Ben Askren. He was furious that Herb Dean stopped that fight early, and which he did. That was not a bulldog choke. The guy was not going unconscious. And he was furious about it, but he for a second, he was angry, and then he said, it's not your fault, Herb, you're a great ref. To have that kind of class and control when the stakes are so high, very impressive. Or to, be that classy with sincerity. Not the John Jones, go check on Lyoto and get some fans. But this one, I saw someone say that they stuck the landing, and I think that's absolutely... There's a very few... You get lots of good fights if you follow fighting, but there's very few sort of perfect moments. I'm talking George Foreman winning back the heavyweight belt. I'm talking, in MMA, UFC 217 was a really just beautiful. You had Rose Namajunas, TJ Dillashaw, and George St. Pierre all win titles. I believe they all won them back. Was that Namajunas versus Zhang 1? I can't remember, but you had three of them win titles. Certainly TJ Dillashaw and GSP were regaining titles, or GSP was winning the middleweight title after coming back from a long time off. There were lots of fun fights on it, but it was just like three perfect moments back to back. And it's a lot of people's favourite card ever. Lots of people remember that as one of the best. And it was a great card, but it's not always necessary to do with the quality of the fights. It's often to do with the moment that's produced. And this one, Robbie Lawler got it done quickly. Was sort of teetering on the edge of emotional because he's a very stoic was the word they kept using. He's plays it close to the chest. He's a cool guy, and then they brought out this highlight reel of him, which I don't think they've ever done. They didn't do it for like Cowboy Cerrone or anyone, did they? They just brought this highlight reel out and they said, we want you to watch this. And man, there was not his corner were behind him in the camera shot, and Robbie Lawler was there, and they were all tearing up, and I was tearing up watching it at home. I just thought that they nailed this because they could have shown that if he lost. Still, they could say, "Thank you, Robbie. Here's the thing. Here's the highlight reel. Here's some of your best moments and so on." But a lot of people don't announce that they're going to retire beforehand. Yeah, I was watching him on the way to the back, and I thought, he didn't even have time to do the silly gloves thing. He didn't take his gloves off and put them in the cage. No, because he got the retirement right. He just walked out with his wife, signed a load of stuff on the way out because he was being a class act, and really lovely moment. You don't get those often. And obviously, not great for Nico Price, who gets knocked out and loses half his purse, but that's the way the fight game works. Someone always has to lose. I felt like this with Dan Hooker versus Jalen Turner because they were both very cool as the decision was being read, and they were sort of smiling and laughing. And they did a little handshake. But of course, the ones that you don't want to lose, it's got to hurt more to lose a close split decision because you've done everything that you could to have won, and you could have won, but you lose half your money as a result. So you had the hardest fight possible, and you also lose half your money. But we'll do the other emotional moment in a minute, which was Pantoja calling out his deadbeat dad. That got me. But Rob Whittaker versus Dricus du Plessis was a weird one. Dricus du Plessis has been on my radar since I was doing stuff about Roberto Soldic, because the classy blokes at KSW have always said, if you want high-quality footage to use for a Filthy Casuals guide or whatever, we'll give it to you. And so I did Roberto Soldic, and I haven't done anything since because I don't really follow KSW very well. But the guy standing out on Roberto Soldic's record was Dricus du Plessis, who knocked him out. And I watched du Plessis' fights, and I was like, how did this guy knock out Soldic, who's coming up superstar? And then he came to the UFC, and he had that fight with Trevin Giles? And he was sort of awkward, and Trevin Giles has a very smooth, glidey, point fighty style, and Dricus du Plessis was doing weird stuff, and he was doing some clever stuff, I remember. I need to go back and listen to the episode, but I remember talking about him and being like, I quite like him, he does some weird stuff. And then he just backed to the fence, lifted his chin up and ran in spamming haymakers and knocked out Trevin Giles. And it was so weird. And I said, he's an interesting character. And then he did that through the whole middleweight division. But I think the weirdness has sort of undermined that he is quite crafty. And apparently gets a very good read on his opponents. You know, I think it was whatever the African promotion is, EFC or something. They used to put out videos talking about him being an elite tactician and so on. But after the fight, in the interviews, I didn't give a shit about all the Africans. I think it's all sort of escalated badly because, you know, I think there is something to be said for Dricus du Plessis saying I am the first guy succeeding, sort of training out of Africa. Because EFC exists, it's one of the big I think it's the biggest African promotion. But he was the EFC champion. He had like 10 or 11 fights in EFC, and you do want to see the African scene take off. That's what like Francis Ngannou's been trying to do. He's made PFL promise to do an African tournament. So I think there is some discussion to be had there, like, you know, without the racist shit, but relitigating like colonialism and its role through MMA. No, don't give a shit about doing that. That sounds terrible. But anyway, that whole thing got overshadowed by Izzy coming in and trying to bait him into saying the N-word, which was quite funny but also very silly. But before that, he was talking about the specifics of the matchup, and he's saying, I watched the film, I noticed he was having trouble with southpaws, and particularly when people switched to southpaw and threw the jab. And that's what he'd been doing. Like, he stunned him with 3 jabs in that fight when he switched to southpaw. He hit him with a load of southpaw step-up outside low kicks, so step-up lead leg kick to the leg. He was timing him with counter jabs really nicely from southpaw. It was really interesting, and unfortunately it got sort of overshadowed by the you know, African brother stuff. I'd quite like to hear him talk about what he saw in Robert Whittaker before the fight, because Robert Whittaker is one of the best fighters in the world, and he worked him out. You know, Robert Whittaker's mechanics are much nicer. Robert Whittaker is faster than this dude. It's easy to be like, well, he's massive, Dricus du Plessis. Yeah, but that didn't make him hit Robert Whittaker first. The thing that no one can do. And then his grappling is very interesting, because in the Brunson fight, he uses an empty half guard, which is when you're in bottom side control. You put the foot that's nearest to them, you like reach it back like you're trying to look at what's on your heel. Hello, sailor. And you put it over their trailing leg. And it sort of makes them do stuff, or you can do some interesting reversals from there. But people use it to get back to butterfly guard and so on. But then he threw his legs up in the air over his head and used them to pendulum himself back up to sitting and scramble away. And people were like, well, he's just spazzing out on the ground. And you're like, no, he must have done that dozens of times in training. Just because it's unorthodox doesn't mean that he's not practiced it and hasn't worked out that that's something he does. Because in this fight, he did a fucking toesy smash, which you don't ever see. Toesy passing is a form of guard passing and guard break. So everyone always has trouble with the closed guard, particularly in no-gi and MMA. It's a form of breaking the guy's feet apart and getting over his guard without standing, which is very valuable if you can do it. And it was, I think it's Roberto Tosi, but there was a guy called Tosi who was famous for doing it. It's also sometimes called Sao Paulo pass or Sao Paulo passing. You get an underhook on the guy from top of closed guard. And then there's a couple of ways to break the legs open. Sometimes you switch your hips and you use your thigh to unhook their ankles and step over their leg, which is something that Wilson Hayes used to do. So if you look up the Wilson pass, that's what he used to call it. But the Tosi smash is where you get up on the balls of your feet or up on your you tripod up while you've got this underhook. You pass your other hand across their head and you crumple them down sideways, and you just crush their body like down sideways, and they have to open their legs. And he did that to Robert Whittaker, and Robert Whittaker was so uncomfortable he let him pass to side control. Rob Whittaker, very good grappler, and Dricus du Plessis just mogged him. So in his last 2 fights, he's shown a empty half guard escape, a pendulum escape, and a Tosi pass. So the idea that this guy doesn't know what he's doing and is just spazzing out is mental. With that being said, lots of good stuff from Rob Whittaker in this fight. I thought I really like, he did his front kick to leaping left hook again, which I love. Front kick to the face, leaping left hook. That's how he knocked out Brad Tavares, but he did a really good one here against du Plessis. And he kept timing the jab as du Plessis stepped in to kick, which is something he's so good at. If you watch Koji Horiguchi, against Manal Kapp, he did this loads. But if you can read when the guy's stepping in with a kick and you slide down the side and jab him, you can send him flying through the air. And Robert Whittaker is very good at landing that counter. But it was the southpaw jab. It was du Plessis going southpaw and landing that jab because Rob Whittaker drops his lead hand when he comes in, particularly to throw the right straight. He was hammering him. He caught him square on the face like 3 times with this. Stunned him. Ran after him. I mean, it's quite funny listening to du Plessis talk about his fights because he says, like, And I knew I had to not run after him because I have a problem with that. It's like, yeah, he does get, his excitement does get the better of him. I mean, he did chase after Rob Whittaker here, and he landed a nice body shot, and he swarmed on him and stuff. I mean, Rob Whittaker, what I got from the first Adesanya fight, sometimes he can get a bit flustered. It's interesting because against Yoel Romero in the first fight or the second fight, he got pretty badly hurt, and he did some of the best sort of fighting hurt that I've ever seen. He ran, he held, he pushed away, he kept a high guard and threw elbows like John Haggerty does when he's hurt. He put his back foot to the fence and teeped when Romero ran in on him. But sometimes he seems to like get in his own head when he's hurt. I think against the Adesanya the first time, he really did. He got hurt, and then the more sort of sloppy he started fighting. I mean, this one he got followed up on quick, so he just sort of covered up and went to the fence and didn't really get anything going. But yeah, I think. I mean, I already respected Du Plessis because he is one of the better middleweights in the world. Even though the middleweight division is a bit of a mess, he is one of the better middleweights in the world. But I think there's always room for this conversation about like mechanics versus tactics, because mechanics is whether your striking looks pretty or not. Tactics is how you land shit. Tactics is things you've seen, things you've read, as in read in the opponent, not read in books. But I mean, you can read things in books, and his tactics were on point for this fight, even if his mechanics weren't always pretty. Meanwhile, Rob Whittaker tends to bring the same sort of tactics to every fight, using the jab, occasionally throwing the right hand afterwards, occasionally throwing the 1-2 high kick, with the takedowns mixed in. That's about as far as his tactics evolve. Sometimes he uses takedowns, but he relies heavily on his mechanics and his speed and his sort of his point fighting mechanics, which are very effective at getting in and out and making the guy sort of move to you and catching him as he steps in. So yes, there's always room for that conversation about tactics versus mechanics. I don't think there's a winner. I just think it's an important consideration, especially because you're always going to meet someone who has faster hands or faster feet or better footwork or whatever, and you need to be able to. It's like Corey Sandhagen said, you are going to meet people who want it more, and you're going to meet people who are more talented than you. You have to find ways to win, and that's tactics. That's tactics, baby. Co-main event. Let's talk about it. Alejandro Pantoja versus Sanjay Pantoja versus Brandon Moreno. I wrote a big thing about Pantoja last week, or week before, can't remember, but if you're a Patreon boy, go read it. I said he's a bar-brawling backtaker because his striking is 1-2-2-2, and then the most beautiful jiu-jitsu you see in MMA, typically, underused. But this was the first fight he's had about 30 fights now, in 30 fights where he really was using his left hand well, and he moved to American Top Team a little while ago. Cup was with Top Team, so I think it was probably after that. But they've done a good thing with him because I was saying like his left hook, he threw one in the second fight with Brandon Moreno and hurt him with it, and he never throws the left hook. He always throws 1-2, and then he pulls his right hand back and throws it again. He's a very sort of sloppy brawler. This one, he threw a jab, squared his hips as if to throw his usual right hand, and stepped through, shifted with the left hook, and dropped Moreno. It was so fast I had to watch it 3 or 4 times while I was watching this first time before realising, they'll show the replay at the end of the round anyway. But yeah, hooked off the jab, dropped Moreno, and he kept landing that. The jab and then the left hook immediately after. It's a very sneaky man. Whoever's taught him that, very good job. You've just made him a threat from both sides of the plate instead of just 1-2-2-2 or 1-2 low kick or 1-2 high kick. Everything was off his right side. There was still a lot of the traditional Pantoja. He just took a beating in this fight. And Brandon Moreno is so much better than the first 2 times they met. Because Brandon Moreno, one, he sort of adopted a jab, which really did help him out. His jab was bouncing off Pantoja's face constantly. But I was talking in the pre-fight stuff about I'd like to see Brandon Moreno land the counter left hook and then clinch up and push away or land some elbows or but don't try and combination counterpunch against this guy. And he was doing quite well at that early on. He'd throw like a slappy left hook right straight and then duck in. And he was doing that a lot, and he was just jabbing and moving off. But the longer combination work is what lets Pantoja get into the fight, because he just sort of toughs his way through. But there were some lovely back takes in this one. I mean, Moreno got the first takedown and got on Pantoja's back. And if you want to, this is the thing, Pantoja is a wild man until he gets on the mat, and then you see just really high-level stuff working extremely well. And you go, why are you never, like, initiating this, mate? Because he had Moreno on his back, and he kept his hands on Moreno's choking hand, and he used, can't remember which way around it was. So let's say Moreno's left leg was on the bottom. Pantoja brought his right foot all the way up to his crotch, put it on the inside of Moreno's left foot and pushed it down to the mat, and then popped his hip over it and was out. Really beautiful leg dexterity to do that in the middle of a fight when the guy's sort of still punching you and trying to choke you. Very cool. You saw a lot of Pantoja's, you saw a bit of Pantoja's crab ride stuff. We were talking about this in my article, but he's a guy who doesn't need to throw you down to the mat. He's very comfortable using the crab ride. He'll get the back body lock along the fence, and then he'll work his knee in between you and the fence, and he'll sit down with you in his lap. And then he can come up on the leg drag, as he did against Moreno. Moreno then pulled him into a leg entanglement, which was nice. But, yeah, he's very good at just, like, he doesn't have to get the takedown. He can just sit down with his hands locked around you. When he's behind you, of course. But he also got some really nice takedowns in this one. Boxing into entries and boxing into the clinch, which is something that I love seeing from him, and he doesn't do a lot. Like, there's never that urgency to do it. He just wants to get in people's faces and beat them up. And there is, you get the sense he's a guy who fights like that because he knows that's what should work for fans. Even so, he's, anyone who's seen him fight knows he's the most, certainly one of the top 3 most exciting fighters in the flyweight division. He's probably one of the more exciting fighters just generally in the UFC at the moment. But they'd still done a terrible job at promoting him. No one really knew who he was. He was on the flyweight, he was on the undercard most of the time. He got in the cage after this, having won the split decision, and he, brought almost everyone to tears by being like, "My mum raised me on my own. Are you proud now, Dad?" And I was just like, man, I want to see him kick his dad's ass. That's what I want. Fly his dad in. But yeah, he literally said, like, at the weigh-ins, he said, "I don't know why you're booing me. I'm a really good fighter." And then at this fight, after the fight, he said, because Brandon Moreno is big in the Mexican community, which is huge in the fight fan base, and he's also big in the nerd community, and they're big in the fight fan base, and they are awful because they booed the shit out of Pantoja for winning this very close fight. And Pantoja said, "If you knew my story, you'd love me." And I was like, yeah, well, maybe the fucking UFC should have done a better job of promoting this guy in the co-main event. But it was very good, it was very sweet seeing him and his 4 kids and his wife. And then they had Glover Teixeira, and it looked like Gilbert Burns was sitting in Glover Teixeira's lap. But Gilbert Burns was blubbing before they even announced the decision. And then when Alejandro Pantoja is saying, like, "Are you proud of me now, Dad?" Gilbert Burns is just bawling. He's a very emotional man, that Gilbert Burns, but respect to him. I think ATT is a great place for Pantoja because if he can walk, ATT saved Robbie Lawler with his defensive wall wrestling and his clinch striking that he was able to do because he was more comfortable in the clinch and wall wrestling up. ATT could do great things for Pantoja offensively. If he can go to the wall wrestling, if he can push people to the fence, I think they'll do great work for him. Brandon Moreno, he loses the belt, but it was a close fight. They could book the rematch, and this was one of the fights of the year already, so they could book the rematch and happily do that. Man, there's a left uppercut. He throws a left uppercut as Pantoja's coming in, so a lead hand uppercut. Jacks his head back. And this has happened in all 3 fights. This is crazy. He always he makes this read, he gets this beautiful punch off, and then he gets hit by 2 punches coming back from Pantoja, whose head is like up at the ring lights when he does it. It just sums up the rivalry. Like Moreno is slicker, and he's only gotten more slicker, and Pantoja is just all heart and all toughness, with a little bit of stuff mixed in now that's trickier. And actually, when he was a little bit trickier, he was giving Brandon Moreno hell. But I loved this fight, and I think you should, if you skipped this because it's flyweights and you only watch, you only pirate the main event afterwards, if you skip this, give this a watch because it's an absolute joy, and both of these guys are brilliant fighters. And Pantoja, Brandon Moreno had a pretty late career, renaissance, kind of like what we were talking about with Robbie Lawler. But Pantoja, if he continues fighting like this, or on the trajectory he is, where he's just adding some new stuff to his sort of one-note game previously, man, he's going to be a monster. Let's round out the main card, and then I'll do the prelims on the boy cast on Wednesday. But Dan Hooker versus Jalen Turner, I thought this was a fantastic fight. Everyone thought this was a fantastic fight. This would have been fight of the night if the co-main event hadn't just knocked everyone's tits off. Turner was doing fantastic early on. He's 6'3", and Dan Hooker, I think, is 6'1". Dan Hooker is normally the very tall freak in his fights. But he was like, whoa, this guy's even taller than me. Which has happened, I think, once before with James Vick. And he did a good job of handling that. Ironically, Turner was doing well with the hooks, and Hooker was trying to turn Turner. Hooker was on the outside for a lot of the first 2 rounds, trying to float and move. and low kick, and Turner was landing good counter right hooks in the exchanges. The second round is just like, first round's okay, and then second round things get cooking because Jalen Turner kicks him in the head really fast. Fastest I've seen a high kick come up in a little while. Yeah, I'll say it in a little while. I watched Super Bon a couple of weeks ago. But really fast high kick, smacks Dan Hooker in the head, cuts his forehead open, has him bleeding everywhere, runs him down. Things are going badly for Dan Hooker. And then later in the round, Dan Hooker throws a jab, dip, left hook, right straight. We love the jab and dip. It's good for covering distance. Jab, dip, left hook, right straight. And then he runs him to the fence because he stunned him. And then he ends the round getting on Turner's back and choking him. And Turner he wasn't fighting the hands. His eye, they kept saying his eyes were wide, but he just looked like he was ready to. It looked like it was one of those finishes where the guy's like, oh, okay, he's going to choke me and then I'll tap. Yeah, but it could also have been that he knew that there were 10 seconds left in the round. He would have heard the clapper, or maybe he wouldn't because the crowd were going mental. But third round, he comes out and Dan Hooker, he tries to sort of put on Hooker for the early seconds, and then Dan Hooker gets all over him. But then the very end of the fight, he gets up from under Hooker and he looks like he's got his second wind. He lands a couple of good shots before the round end. Really just a great fight. Jalen Turner, he had this great streak of 4 or 5 finishes, with Brad Riddell being the most notable and most recent. But his last 2 against Gamrot and Hooker, 2 very different specialists with very different builds and attributes, but tough guys. And I've probably got more. I've learned more positively about Jalen Turner in those last 2 fights than I think I did in the 5 finishes, to be honest. I've been more impressed with those just because he was operating at the level of these guys who were considered a little bit better than him. The Brad Riddell one was very impressive, to be fair. But yeah. Good for Hooker, though. Another one in the win column. I'm just glad he's not considering featherweight anymore because that was insanity. And his grappling did make the difference. We were talking about that on the pre-show. Like, he is very... I mean, they don't call him the Hangman for no reason, but his grappling is very underrated. Which is why when Islam Makhachev took him down and people were like, well, he's a one-dimensional kickboxer. It's like, no, he isn't really. He's actually pretty good on the ground. Maybe there are just, look to camera, levels to this. Bruh. I hate saying there are levels to this, but there are levels to this. T-shirts coming soon. Yeah, I think that'll do us for today. Oh, sorry, Bo Nickel versus Val Woodburn. That was a level change into a leaping lead hook, which, like, classic Kevin Randleman Crow Cop setup. Loved it. The one that was missing off this card was Jay Della Maddalena. His opponent signed at short notice, and we were all very disappointed that it was just some guy and not they didn't try and fix the fight. As in, like, fix the matchup rather. Make Della Maddalena fight a week later against someone good, or 2 weeks later. But they're now having to do that because his opponent, fucking hell, I don't know how fast these things develop, but it makes you worry about what LFA's been doing for their medicals, because the pre-fight medical picked up that this guy would have had some kind of clotting at the brainstem that, if he fought and got hit a lot, which he probably would have because he was the massive underdog coming in against a great hitter, if he'd taken some damage, he might have died. Crazy to think about. And, we rag on commissions a lot because they are typically in the pockets of the biggest promoter, and they do just let people cheat a lot of the time, it seems. Or the retroactive therapeutic use exemption is the one that I always point to. Like, that is just saying we forgive you for cheating because you're too important. But this is why you do need something in place, some kind of commission, because there are plenty of promotions, not even big promotions, regional promotions, but things like that. You need to have people checked beforehand. You need the physicals because people develop stuff all the time. People get, like, blood clots and so on, and aneurysms and things that could be ticking time bombs. It's not all, obviously you can't prevent all deaths in MMA, but you do want to prevent the ones that are like a pre-existing condition that was then made worse by getting punched in the head. And to be honest, like, this guy could have died in training. That's crazy. So I'm not going to look up his name right now, but man, hope he gets well soon. And I hope he can return to his career healthy and have a really successful career, and ends up in the UFC on his own merit, and impresses everyone, because he was a good guy. Like, his record was good for a guy coming in off the regionals. He was just like, he was going to get his chance off a series of mishaps, and then he had some really bad luck, or maybe it was really good luck that he got called in for a physical at this time. Anyway, that's all speculating about the existence of God and miracles and things. So let's call it a day there. I will be back midweek for the Boycast. We'll talk about some of these prelims fights. My girl Yasmin Uruguay with the amazing abs, she got knocked out. But we'll talk about those prelim fights, and we'll talk about some other stuff going on this weekend, mainly the Holly Holm bollocks. And if it's that bad, maybe I'll do a bit more of my Sifu playthrough. I'm going to write something this week too. So yeah, if you want to get in on all my extra content, sign up to the Patreon. If you want to read that Robbie Lawler article or the Advanced Striking 2.0 Alexander Volkanovski, those are both free. Go have a read of those and share them with everyone you know. Even if they're like, I don't care about your fight shit, stop talking about your fight shit to me. And you're like, I don't have any real life friends who like fights. Share it with them. If you want to send an email to the podcast, jackslackpodcast@gmail.com. And if you want to see what I'm writing anytime, fightprimer.com. I am your boy, Jack Slack. Let's all beat up Alexandra Pantoja's dad. Bless.